Hello, Tributes, and welcome to the first episode of Ashes of the Hunger Games. Before we start, I'd like to thank Christian Blanco, who made Tales of the Hunger Games, and Lauren, who made Panem Reborn. Without them, I wouldn't have had the inspiration to make the Hunger Games stories like this one and so many others on my channel. I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean for making the art used in this video. Now, good luck and may the odds be ever in your favor. Hello? Is this thing on? I can never tell with these old mics. I'm so used to the new Oh, we're good? To go? Good. Alright, time to do my whole introduction thing for the tape I'm recording, I presume. Log file 1, year 10,000, Panem. Speaker name, Aemilius Vesta. Volunteer historian after the firing of historian Cato Snow in the Historical Museum for Panem. Location, basement. Why did I even volunteer to do this job? The only games I know even a smidge about are the ones still going on. The new Hunger Games. Can't wait to start reading those files. I don't even know what year these games took place. They should have had someone with a bit more experience than me read these files and left me to the Discord Hunger Games files. I guess I better work with what was given to me before complaining. It is unknown to me what year exactly the 176th Hunger Games took place, but I do have a general idea that it was a few thousand years ago, possibly before the 5000s, heck, possibly even before the 4000s. So, for the sake of making things easy, I'm just gonna assume that the 176th Hunger Games took place in the year 3240. The president at the time of these games was none other than one of my ancestors by the name of Pontus Vesta. Pontus was known to introduce a new rule to the games, which is still in use today, known as the 3-for-4 rule. This rule announced that 4 districts would be picked out from a reaping bowl, and these 4 tributes would each have to send in an extra tribute, male or female, to compete in the games. A week before the reapings were set to take place, President Pontus would step onto the stage and reach his hand into a reaping bowl. He would then take out a slip of paper with a big red 9 on it. This caused laughter from the Capitolites in the crowd, as District 9 hadn't received a victor in a long time. Some Capitolites even joked that District 9 may actually have a chance this year, although these capital citizens didn't believe that they actually would. President Pontus then reached back into the reaping bowl and picked out another slip of paper. This slip of paper had a big red 10 on it. This caused more laughs from the capital citizens. These capital citizens then again made the same jokes for District 10 as they did for District 9. Just like District 9, District 10 tributes were known for dying quite early on, even though they were some of the stronger competitors in the arena. President Pontus then reached back into the bowl again and picked out another off-white piece of paper. This piece of paper had a big red 3 on it. This caused the capital citizens to get a little more excited. District 3 was one of the smartest districts in all of Panem, aside from the career districts. Capitolites expected the tributes from this district to make it decently far, as they normally do. President Pontus then reached back into the reaping bowl again and picked out the final piece of paper. This paper had a big red 7 on it. This caused tears throughout the capital. District 7 was disputed as a career district and the only career district to be picked out for the extra tribute this year. Capitolites were excited to see how District 7 fared with the extra tribute at their disposal. In District 10, female and male youths alike muttered angrily to each other about this new rule introduced. Although District 12 was back, the odds that any of the districts would be picked was higher, considering that 4 districts are picked for this rule. When Durian Fennel, victor of the 175th Hunger Games, got onto the stage, he received boos from across the enclosures. Durian just rolled his eyes at this. It wasn't his fault that the president introduced this new rule. It wasn't his fault that this district was picked for the role of sending in extra tributes. His ally was from this district and saved his life by giving hers. Durian sighed and walked over to the female reaping bowl and picked out a piece of off-white paper. Durian then sighed and read out the name of 12-year-old Bianca Valentines. When Bianca heard her name, she burst into tears almost immediately. Bianca was only 12. Her twin sister had said that she'd be okay and they wouldn't pick her name. Boy, was she wrong. Just then, Durian and Bianca heard someone volunteering as tribute. Bianca and Durian both looked behind them to see Bianca's twin sister, Berlina, walking out into the aisle. Bianca immediately screamed and cried harder as she saw Berlina walk out into the aisle. Berlina let a few tears rush down her face before running to Bianca and hugging her. Berlina promised Bianca that she would win and return home. Bianca continued to cry as Berlina helped her back into her spot in the reaping enclosure. Berlina then said that she loved Bianca before walking towards the stage. When she got onto the stage, she shook hands with the victor on the stage. She then apologized to Durian for her fellow citizens of District 10 and acknowledged that it wasn't Durian's fault that her district was in this spot. She then leaned up against the wall behind Durian and sighed as Durian continued the reapings. Durian walked over to the male reaping bowl and picked out another off-white piece of paper and looked at it for a few seconds. He then recognized the last name, but from where? He then read out the name of 16-year-old Lennox Warren. When Lennox heard his name, he sighed. He didn't have very high hopes for victory. The last time that District 10 had achieved a victory was 6 games ago. In his mind, District 10's last victory was too soon for them to achieve another. Lennox still reluctantly stepped out into the aisle with a smile on his face. If he was gonna die in the games, he was gonna die a hero, much like his sister had in the 175th Hunger Games to save Durian back when Lennox was only 6. When Lennox got onto the stage, he got right in Durian's face and just glared at him. Lennox's eye twitched as he looked down to see Durian's offering hand, but he still shook the victor's hand. He then walked over to Berlina and glared at her. He then stated that although it wasn't Durian's fault that their district had been put in this position, it was his fault that he lost his older sister, and so he hated Durian for that. Berlina just sighed at this before Lennox took his spot against the wall behind Durian. Durian then walked over to another reaping bowl that had been put out on the stage by a peacekeeper that contains the rest of the names in this district. Berlina then picked out another piece of off-white paper and looked at it before starting to tear up. He then read out the name of 12-year-old Bianca Valentines. It seemed that no matter how hard Bianca tried, she could not escape the games. When Bianca's name was called out, Berlina screamed, "Why?" Both girls had screamed out when Bianca's name was called. Just then, another volunteer was heard. This volunteer was a boy this time. Just then, 18-year-old Colby Cutter walked out into the aisle. The boy was the babysitter of both girls. Bianca and Berlina looked at the boy as he walked down the aisle. Bianca and Berlina's parents even mouthed the words "thank you" to the boy as he walked down the aisle. When Colby got onto the stage, he sighed and shook Durian's hand. He then whispered to Durian that if there was any way that he could make sure that Berlina made it out, he would be grateful if Durian made it happen. Durian did think on this for a moment, as his savior was from this district. He felt as though he owed this to her, and so he agreed that he'd try to do whatever he could to swing the odds in her favor. This caused Colby to smile and hug Durian before walking over to his spot against the wall behind Durian. After these reapings, Durian announced Berlina, Lennox, and Colby as this year's tributes for District 10. These tributes were then escorted into the backstage area to be visited by their family and friends. Berlina was visited by her parents and Bianca. After a few moments with their daughters, however, Berlina and Bianca's parents left the room to visit Colby and give the girls some time alone together. During this alone time, Berlina and Bianca just hugged each other and cried. A few moments later, peacekeepers came in to escort Bianca out of the room and escort Berlina to the train. Meanwhile, Lennox was visited by his little sister Carpathia. Although Carpathia was only 13, she gave some pretty good advice. Carpathia told him not to trust the careers like Durian and Coney had. It came as a surprise to Lennox that Carpathia even remembered that, considering that happened when Carpathia was only 3. After a few more moments of Carpathia giving Lennox as much advice as she could think of that would be helpful, peacekeepers came in to escort Carpathia out of the room and escort Lennox onto the train. Finally, Colby got visited by Berlina and Bianca's parents. The pair thanked Colby again for volunteering in place of Bianca. Colby smiled and gave them a slight nod. He then mentioned that he got Durian to promise him that he'd do whatever he could to make sure that Berlina got out alive. This made the pair smile and hug Colby. After a few more moments, peacekeepers came in to escort Bianca and Berlina's parents out of the room and escort Colby to the train. On the train, Berlina sat in a corner of the train and cried. Colby and Lennox looked at each other before looking at Berlina. Both the boys felt bad for the girl. She had to leave her family behind, and she had to go into the games with her favorite babysitter. Eventually, Briscoe Burnett, victor of the 169th Hunger Games, came into the train. Briscoe started off by asking how everyone was doing. This question only garnered glaring from the tributes in the train. Briscoe sighed and asked the tributes if they had any prior experience with weaponry. The only tribute to answer yes to this question was Colby, who had used a butcher's knife considering that was his day job when he wasn't babysitting Berlina and Bianca. For a little while, Briscoe agreed to train Berlina and Lennox with weaponry while Colby sat in the main car waiting for the group. When Briscoe, Berlina, and Lennox came back into the main cart, Briscoe turned on the TV where District 9's reapings were live. A few hours later in District 9, Durian was given a tour of the facilities by the mayor of the district and his 13-year-old daughter, Millie. Millie took a friendly liking to Durian. Durian also struck up a friendship with the little girl from 9. After the tour, Durian was taken to the reaping stage by the mayor and his daughter. Durian looked back at Millie and gave her a reassuring nod before reaching into the female reaping bowl and picking out a slip of off-white paper. He then started to tear up immediately as he read out the name of 13-year-old Millie McDonald. He then looked back at the mayor and his daughter, who started to cry, only making Durian feel worse. Millie got up from her chair on stage and walked over to Durian with her head facing the floor. Millie then slowly and shyly shook Durian's hand. She didn't want to compete, but it was clear that no one was gonna volunteer in her place. Durian then hugged the little girl and promised her that everything was going to be alright. Millie then found her spot up against the wall behind Durian in tears. Durian then took a deep breath before walking over to the mail reaping bowl and took out a slip of paper. He sighed before reading out the name of 12-year-old Kornak Korsakov. When Kornak heard his name, he jumped a little before starting to cry. Just then he heard someone volunteer in his place. This volunteer was revealed to be Kornak's 17-year-old brother Arborio Korsakov. When Arborio volunteered, he wasn't thinking straight. All he wanted to do was protect his brother. Little did he know that him volunteering just sentenced him to be the third tribute. Durian reluctantly stated this, as he was approached by a peacekeeper after the District 10 reapings, saying that he had handled the volunteering situation incorrectly. This statement caused both Kornak and Arborio to scream in fear and anger that they'd have to go into the games together. When the two ginger boys got onto the stage, they glared at Durian before Kornak reluctantly shook his hand, followed by Arborio. The two boys then took their places against the wall behind Durian. After these reapings, Durian announced Millie, Kornak, and Arborio as this year's tributes for District 9. The tributes were then taken into the backstage area in order to be visited by their friends and family. Millie was visited by her dad, Arid, the mayor of District 9. Arid tried his best to help his precious daughter Millie with the immense fear she was experiencing. Meanwhile, all Millie did was hyperventilate and pretty much ignore her dad. After a few minutes of making no progress, peacekeepers came in to escort Arid out of the room and escort Millie to the train. Meanwhile, Kornak was visited by their mom, while Arborio was visited by their dad. Kornak and Arborio had listened intently to the advice given to them via their parents. Arborio had more luck, considering their dad had actually been the victor of the 161st Hunger Games, and was actually going to be their mentor this year. After a few minutes of talking, peacekeepers came into the rooms and escorted Kornak and Arborio's mom out of the building, and escorted Kornak, Arborio, and Flaxen to the train. On the train, Millie immediately got jealous that Kornak and Arborio seemingly got a head start on the training and mentoring from the district's mentor. Flaxen started the training off by telling Millie that although the other two tributes were his sons, he wasn't gonna pick favorites. He then continued by asking the group if they had any prior experience in weaponry. Millie said that she didn't have any experience in weaponry, but she was experienced in toxicology. Kornak said the same thing as Millie, too. This response from the younger tributes didn't really surprise Flaxen. Meanwhile, Arborio stated that he was good at using scythes, considering his job in District 9 used this tool a lot. Flaxen nodded at this before saying that Arborio should train in something he wasn't as familiar with so he'd be able to be more versatile. Arborio nodded in response to this suggestion before leaving the rest of the group and going to his bedroom. Meanwhile, Flaxen took Kornak and Millie to the back of the train where they would eat and continue to talk strategy. After a little while, Flaxen took Millie and Kornak back into the main room of the train. He also called Arborio back into the room. When Arborio got into the room, Flaxen turned on the TV where the reapings for District 7 were live. In District 7, cheers were heard throughout the reaping enclosures as Durian stepped onto the stage. This district was the first district that Durian was truly terrified to do the reapings for. The female tribute from this district had almost killed him in his last games, so he had every right to be scared. As he walked over to the female reaping bowl, before he could even pick out a name, he heard the sound of two volunteers simultaneously. These two volunteers were 18-year-old twin sisters Autumn Woodwind Barbosa and Daffodil Woodwind Jordan. Autumn had married a wealthy 30-year-old man just 2 months ago from the Barbosa family, while her twin sister Daffodil married into the Jordan family. These two girls were the prettiest girls in the district, so they were truly the best choice. Meanwhile, someone else volunteered to join the twins in the games. This volunteer was 18-year-old Jack Jordan. Jack was the man that Daffodil had married to get into the Jordan family. When Daffodil heard Jack volunteer, she cheered. Jack then smiled and ran over to Daffodil and kissed her. Autumn just rolled her eyes at this with a smile on her face before the trio made their way down the aisle and onto the stage. When the trio got onto the stage, Autumn and Daffodil blew flirtatious kisses to the crowd while Jack flexed his muscles for the crowd. The trio then shook Durian's hand, one by one, before taking their positions against the wall. After these reapings, Durian announced Autumn, Daffodil, and Jack as this year's tributes for District 7. After this announcement, the trio was taken backstage to be visited by their family and friends. Autumn was visited by her husband, Ochre Barbosa. Ochre was excited for Autumn. She had secretly always been jealous of Daffodil and always wanted to kill her. Now was her chance to do so. Ochre gave all the advice he could, never having been in the Hunger Games before. The pair then kissed and started to get intimate, before they were ultimately forced apart by a peacekeeper who escorted Ochre out of the room and escorted Autumn to the train. Meanwhile, Daffodil was visited by her ex, Oaken Barbosa. Oaken started off by saying how much he missed her. This caught Daffodil off guard. The breakup had been quite rough. She was getting abused and she had to leave. She felt a surprising feeling she had never thought she'd feel for him, though. She felt as though she missed him too. In no time at all, Oaken kissed Daffodil. Daffodil didn't stop him. She actually kissed him back. The two then started to get intimate. Unlike Autumn, though, they were actually able to finish before a peacekeeper came and escorted Oaken out of the room and escorted Daffodil to the train. Finally, Jack was visited by his parents, Aiden and Aldira. Aiden tried his best to remember the advice passed down to him through the generations, to no avail. Meanwhile, Aldira couldn't stop crying. Jack just smiled and hugged her, making her feel a little better. Eventually, a peacekeeper came in and escorted Aiden and Aldira out of the room and escorted Jack to the train. On the train, Autumn cried as she thought of Ochre. Autumn wanted to surprise Ochre after her victory with the fact that she was pregnant. Now that Autumn was thinking about it, she had probably just sentenced herself to death. Meanwhile, Jack held Daffodil close as she also cried. Jack didn't know why she was crying, and she wouldn't tell him. But after a close review of this scene after the games, it was theorized that she was crying because of what she had done with Oaken. When Hollis got into the main train compartment and saw how the tributes were taking things, she sighed and walked over to Autumn. As Hollis talked to Autumn, Jason came into the train compartment and went over to Jack and Daffodil. These two mentors started the training by asking the tributes if they had any prior experience in weaponry. Thankfully to the pair, all three tributes answered that they were good at axe throwing. Autumn was also good with knives, and while Daffodil was good with swords, and Jack was good with toxicology. The mentors smiled at each other and immediately commented that these tributes would be able to be versatile in the arena. Jason went over to the TV and turned it on. The group watched as a 13-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl got reaped from District 4, before the TV changed to District 3's reaping. In District 3, citizens were yelling curses at Durian. They knew it wasn't his fault they were in this situation, but he was the only person there to blame. This just caused Durian to sigh and roll his eyes. Durian took a deep breath, trying not to lose his mind with all the curses hurled at him. He then put on a smile and walked over to the female reaping bowl. He then reached his hand into the female reaping bowl and picked out an off-white piece of paper. Durian then sighed and read out the name of 18-year-old Adelaide Carver. When Adelaide's name was called, she originally didn't hear it. Her friend next to her in the reaping enclosure had to hold back tears as she used sign language to tell Adelaide that she was reaped. When Adelaide finally got the message from her friend, she screamed and pulled her friend into a tight hug. This is when her friend, who was revealed to be 18-year-old Sophia Tekken, volunteered to be the third tribute for District 3. If Adelaide was going into the arena, she was too in order to protect her. When the pair of girls got onto the stage, they glared at Durian, before Sophia flipped them off and took her spot against the wall. Adelaide used sign language to apologize to Durian before shaking his hand. Durian smiled at the girl and used sign language to thank the girl for her maturity. Adelaide then took her spot against the wall, and while Durian walked over to the male reaping bowl. Durian then picked out a piece of off-white paper before sighing again and reading out the name of 14-year-old Cassio Cunningham. When Cassio's name was called, the cameras immediately zoomed in on a short young man with curly brown hair that was described as soft and fluffy and ocean blue eyes. It was revealed that Cassio's parents had led the rebellions in District 3 after the 175th Hunger Games. Now Cassio was being punished for something his parents had done. Cassio was not going to take this, but he had to. No matter what he tried, he couldn't get out of this seemingly inevitable punishment. When his name was called, he had finally accepted that there was no escape. When Cassio stepped out into the aisle, he looked around at the people in the enclosures. He envied the people around him. Most wouldn't have to know the pain he was feeling in this moment. When Cassio got onto the stage, he glared at Durian before ultimately deciding to shake his hand and take his spot on the wall, all while glaring at the girls now. Durian noticed the clear hatred he was getting from everyone in the district and decided to hurry things up. He announced Adelaide, Sophia, and Cassio as this year's tributes for District 3, and quickly rushed off the stage as peacekeepers came to escort the tributes to the backstage area to be visited by their family and friends. Adelaide was visited by her only living member of her family, her mom, Carmen. Carmen couldn't hold back the tears and hugged Adelaide for what she thought could very well be the last time. Adelaide finally realized the reality of her situation and also cried on her mom's shoulder. Could this be the last time she would ever feel the warm embrace of her mother? Only time will tell. When the peacekeepers came into the room, Carmen didn't want to go. Carmen fought with the peacekeepers, trying to get at least a few more minutes with Adelaide. This just caused the Peacekeepers to turn Carmen around to face Adelaide before shooting Carmen in the forehead, killing her on impact. Meanwhile, Sophia was visited by her little sister, Clorinette. Clorinette put on a fake smile and assured Sophia that everything would be okay. She said that Sophia would survive and come home to her and their parents. That's when Sophia told Clorinette why she volunteered for the Hunger Games. This caused Clorinette to burst into tears and hug Sophia tighter than she had ever hugged anyone in her life. When Peacekeepers came into the room, the pair heard the gunshot from the room next door, and this caused Clorinette to scream and Sophia to hug her one more time before the Peacekeepers escorted Clorinette out of the room and escorted Sophia to the train. Finally, Cassio was visited by his 7-year-old sister, Cassia. Cassia took a deep breath, trying not to cry. Cassia knew there was a high chance she'd never see her older brother again. He was all she had left. She had no idea what she'd do if she lost him this year. After a little while, Cassio noticed Cassia's eyes watering and pulled her into a tight hug. Cassia then started to cry until a peacekeeper came into the room. The peacekeeper escorted Cassia out of the room, and another peacekeeper came in to escort Cassio onto the train. On the train, Adelaide and Sophia sat on a couch and cried in each other's tight embrace. Meanwhile, Cassio was sitting on a couch on the other side of the train cabin. He thought about his little sister, who he'd kill to see again. He felt bad for the duo of girls on the other side of the train, and eventually got up and walked over to them. Cassio used sign language to communicate with the girls. He signed that he was sorry for them getting raped. Because of the tears in her eyes, Adelaide could barely see what Cassio had said to her. Meanwhile, Sophia saw the sign language and hugged Cassio before asking him if he'd help her protect Adelaide in the arena, before explaining that Adelaide's deaf and wouldn't last long in the arena without help. Cassio would nod and agreed to protecting Adelaide. Sophia would smile at this and pull Cassio to the side. She didn't know why she was doing this. Adelaide wouldn't have been able to hear her anyways. Sophia then went on to say that she had feelings for Adelaide. Cassio would gasp with a frown forming on his face. He then asked Sophia why she volunteered instead of maybe telling someone else to protect her so she could possibly reunite with her after the games. Sophia then replied with a stern, "Because she's my friend." The pair then went back to the couch and sat next to Adelaide. Cassio then whispered to Sophia that she'd better tell Adelaide how she feels before it's too late. Sophia just rolled her eyes before saying that she'll do it in training. Cassio and Sophia would then go on to talk to Adelaide until their mentor, Clarion, arrived in the cabin of the train. Clarion would then go on to ask the group if they had any prior weaponry knowledge. Sophia had to use sign language to communicate to Adelaide what Clarion had asked. Cassio replied that he doesn't have much weaponry knowledge, but he did have knowledge in making very complex electrical traps. Meanwhile, Sophia and Adelaide told Clarion that they used to hunt together. Adelaide had also made the stun guns for the peacekeepers, and Sophia worked with complex electrical systems. So, that meant that all three tributes were amazing with electrical traps as well. Clarion then told Sophia to help Cassio with a tiny bit of weapons training before the train arrives in the capital, while he tries to talk to Adelaide. Sophia then rolls her eyes before grabbing Cassio's hand and practically dragging him to the gym in the back of the train. As Sophia trained Cassio in weaponry, Cassio tried to tell Sophia to tell Adelaide about her feelings again. She immediately dropped the fencing sword she had in her hand and slapped Cassio. Cassio then raised Sophia then raised her voice slightly at him, and as she told him that she was gonna do it in training. Cassio had his hands to the side of his cheek in pain as he replied that she should tell her before it's too late. Sophia sighed and rolled her eyes before stating that she'll tell Adelaide about how she feels when they arrive in the capital. The pair then picked up their fencing swords and started to battle until the train arrived in the capital. When the District 10 train arrived in the capital, Briscoe was the first person off the train. He then paused for dramatic effect before introducing the tributes for District 10 this year, to the sound of cheers from the crowd as Lennox, Colby, and Berlina exited the train. Lennox smiled at the cameras as Capital TV personnel interviewed him. They asked him questions like how he was feeling about being reaped and how he was feeling about being reaped alongside one of the youngest tributes this year. But one question caught his eye. This Capital interviewer asked him if he had a special someone at home. He then replied in the affirmative. This reply caused cheers throughout the train station. Meanwhile, Colby took off his shirt and flexed his muscles for the cameras. This caused Briscoe to rush over to Berlina and cover her eyes, while Caprolites rushed over to Colby to feel his muscles. Colby was single, although he wasn't afraid to admit that he had slight feelings for Amara from 1 after seeing the reapings for District 1. Berlina wasn't really surrounded by as many Capitolites as the boys, but it was still enough to make Berlina a little more self-confident. She signed autographs and took selfies with young Capital boys. Eventually, Briscoe managed to escort the District 10 tributes through the crowd. This is when Colby bumped into Amara, who was with her boyfriend and district partner Dior. Amara and Dior glared at the boy before getting into the District 1 limo, while Briscoe brought Colby, Lennox, and Berlina into the District 10 limo. When the limo arrived at the accommodation tower, Briscoe brought the trio up to their room, where when they got into the room, Berlina smiled and looked around. Meanwhile, Briscoe, Colby, and Lennox had a conversation on who would give up their room and sleep on the couch so that Berlina could have a place to sleep. Eventually, the trio agreed that Briscoe would give up his room for Berlina. When the District 10 stylist, Arabella Snow, arrived in the room, she had her team get started on taking the measurements of the tributes. Arabella would then go on to describe that the tributes would be dressed in suits and dresses made of slabs of meat. This was meant to be reminiscent of the meat dress worn by Lady Gaga herself at the MTV Video Music Awards back in 2010. The group smiled at each other before ultimately agreeing to wear these outfits, and the stylist team left the room to start working on the outfits. Meanwhile, when the District 9 train arrived in the train station, Flaxen was the first off the train. It was obvious he had taken a page from Briscoe's book of dramatic entrances when he took a dramatic pause before introducing the tributes from District 9. This is when Cornac, Arborio, and Millie exited the train to the sounds of cheers from the Capital crowd. Cornac was swarmed by Capital TV personnel who asked him questions like how he felt that he was one of the youngest tributes this year. He was also asked how he felt about his brother being one of his competitors. This proved to be too much for Cornac, and he started to tear up, causing Flaxen to take him to the side and deal with the interviewers himself. Meanwhile, Arborio took pictures with the Capitol crowd. He also signed autographs, even being asked to sign a very excited Capitol girl's chest. Arborio enjoyed the attention as opposed to his little sister, or his little brother. When Flaxen took Cornac to the side, though, Arborio kept watch over Cornac as Flaxen took care of the interviewers. Finally, Millie was swarmed by other Capitol TV personnel. They asked her how her father felt. They also asked her how it felt to be the daughter of the mayor of District 9. Millie tried to answer as many questions as she could before Flaxen came and grabbed her so he could take her, Cornac, and Arborio to the accommodation tower. When the group got to the accommodation tower, Millie and Cornac looked around the room. This caused Arborio and Flaxen to sigh. The accommodation rooms still didn't have enough bedrooms for 3 tributes and the mentor, so Flaxen immediately gave up his room for Millie. Eventually, the District 9 stylist, Aerolise Snow, came into the room. Aerolise was the twin sister of the District 10 stylist, and so it was suspected that the styles would be similar, but obviously not the exact same. As her team got the measurements of the tributes, Aerolise stated that she'd be dressing the tributes in dresses and suits made of wheat. The trio of tributes looked confused at first, but soon agreed to wear these outfits. Aerolise and her team then finished up getting the trio's measurements before leaving the room to start making the outfits. When the District 7 train arrived in the capital, Jason and Hollis were the first 2 people off the train. Hollis and Jason then held each other's hands and lifted them into the sky to show pride for their district, and the tributes they trained. Just then, Jack, Autumn, and Daffodil ran out of the train under Jason and Hollis's arms. This was a common tribute entrance for the career districts of 1, 2, 4, and now 7. Autumn and Daffodil were swarmed by Capitol boys who were begging for kisses in even numbers. Autumn and Daffodil didn't give in to the temptations, though. Meanwhile, Jack was swarmed by Capitol TV personnel who asked him how it felt to be competing against his wife in the Hunger Games. Jack would state that it didn't feel right competing against his wife, but it did feel right that he was representing his home district with pride. This caused cheers from nearby Capitolites. Eventually, Jason and Hollis took the tributes away from the crowd and met up with the tributes from District 4. These 2 districts were disputed as career districts, although most of the Capitol, even the president, agreed that these 2 districts are in fact careers. Although the thoughts that District 7 had towards this year's tributes from District 4 weren't the best because they were some of the youngest tributes in the arena this year. They still kept up with their tradition of meeting up with the District 4 tributes and going to the accommodation tower together. When the group arrived in the accommodation tower, the District 7 tributes actually showed some love for the District 4 tributes before going to their room. When the group arrived in their room, Jason agreed to give up his room for anyone who wanted it. Jack and Daffodil held hands, saying that they'd be sleeping in the same room, so they needed a bigger bed. This made Autumn let them take Jason's room. When the District 7 stylist, Caracalla Underwood, came into the room, she immediately had her team start work on their measurements. She also said that she'd be dressing the tributes in dresses and suits made of leaves. At first, Autumn and Daffodil complained that they might be itchy. Meanwhile, Jack immediately accepted the outfits with open arms. Caracalla told the girls to stop complaining or she'd make their dresses out of poison ivy instead. This immediately shut the girls up. The team then finished up with the measurements before leaving the room and getting started with making the outfits. Finally, when the District 3 train arrived in the capital train station, Clarion was the first to exit. He made a dramatic pause before introducing the tributes. That's when Cassio, Adelaide, and Sophia exited the train. Sophia and Adelaide stuck together so that Sophia could help Adelaide understand the citizens of the capital. Capital TV personnel swarmed the pair and asked them how it felt to be going into the games together. Sophia used a combination of sign language so that Adelaide could understand, and actual words so that the Capital TV personnel could understand as well. She answered this question by saying that it felt odd, but she was willing to do whatever she had to in order to protect Adelaide. This answer caused sympathetic sounds from the Capitalites. Meanwhile, Cassio was swarmed by Capital children who were more interested in battling against each other and possibly Cassio with their fake swords. Cassio took this opportunity to get popular with the kids. Cassio took a wooden sword that was offered to him before battling with a little boy named Emilius Anderson. Emilius's twin sister Emilia stood to the side and watched as Cassio started off by going easy on Emilius, which caused Emilius to easily take him down. After this first round, Emilius told Cassio not to take it so easily on him. This caused Cassio to easily take Emilius down during the second round. Emilius and Emilia laughed at this and hugged Cassio before he gave Emilia her sword back, and the two kids continued to battle with each other. Eventually, Clarion took the tributes away from the crowds of Capitalites to take them to the accommodation tower. When they got to the District 3 limo, they saw the tributes from District 2 still being swarmed by Capitalites. The two tributes from District 2 this year were both members of the Dalton family. When these Daltons saw the District 3 tributes, they scoffed before continuing to show love to the Capital crowds as the District 3 tributes got into their limo. When the District 3 limo arrived at the accommodation tower, Clarion took the tributes to the room. The entire time they were walking, Cassio gave Sophia a look, although Sophia didn't know what this look was for at the time. When the tributes finally made it to the District 3 apartment, Cassio took Sophia to the side to talk to her. He asked her if she told Adelaide about her feelings. Sophia rolled her eyes and stated that she couldn't tell her. Cassio sighed and dropped the conversation as the stylist for District 3, Ada Phantom, victor of the 142nd Hunger Games, came into the room. As Ada's team took the tributes' measurements, Ada talked to the tributes about what she'd be dressing them in. She stated that she'd be dressing the girls in black dresses with neon yellow accents to represent electricity. Ada would then be dressing Cassio in a suit that matches the girls' dresses. The group ultimately agreed to this, and Ada and her team smiled at the group before leaving the room. While the tributes waited in the tunnel, the District 7 tributes approached the District 4 tributes. Jack stated that he didn't trust the tributes from 1 and 2, to which the others agreed. Bermuda and Bastion, both from 4, immediately suggested that they ally together in order to take down the other careers. Jack, Daffodil, and Autumn immediately agreed to this. Meanwhile, Cassio gave Adelaide and Sophia some space so Sophia could finally tell Adelaide what she had been hiding. Sophia took a deep breath before nervously approaching Adelaide. When Cassio saw this, he smiled, thinking that she was telling Adelaide. Meanwhile, Sophia used sign language to communicate how she felt for Adelaide. This caused Adelaide to smile and hug Sophia. So Adelaide then used sign language to communicate the fact that she felt the same and had these feelings ever since the pair met 10 years ago. This caused Sophia to smile and blush. The pair then continued to chat as Cassio looked around for the tributes from 5. Meanwhile, Colby gets approached by Amara and Dior, both from 1, and Adira and Emerentius, both from 2. This group starts a conversation with Colby about possibly joining the career pack. Eventually, Colby agrees just as long as Berlina could join with him. Although Colby had a crush on Amara, he still had a duty to protect Berlina and wasn't gonna leave her behind. Amara, Dior, Adira, and Emerentius didn't go for this, though, and instead left, but not before Emerentius threatened Colby that he'd be the first person that the careers would attack. After seeing this interaction, Jack, Autumn, Daffodil, Bermuda, and Bastion approached the District 10 chariot. The group talked with Colby, Lennox, and Berlina about joining their alliance. At first they disagreed because they thought that the District 4 and 7 tributes were careers as well, until they came clean about not trusting Districts 1 and 2. It took a little while, but Colby, Lennox, and Berlina finally agreed to join the others in an alliance. Finally, Millie stays with the District 9 chariot, about to cry, until Betty and Alfonsine, both from 12, approach her. The pair talked with her for a little while, until Cornac came back to the District 9 chariot with Arborio and Florence from 11. Betty and Alfonsine then asked if Millie wanted to join them at the District 12 chariot, to which Millie agreed. The trio went over to the District 12 chariot. It was here that Alfonsine and Betty asked Millie to ally with them. They stated that the reason why they originally approached her was because they noticed that she could use a friend. This conversation ultimately ended with Millie agreeing to ally with Alfonsine and Betty. This is when the chariot started to leave the tunnel, and Millie ran back to the District 9 chariot with Arborio and Cornac. As the District 3 chariot left the tunnel, Capital H cheered over the colorful design of the outfits that the tributes wore. The Capital TV producers even stated that the color combinations used on the outfits were the perfect colors to combine to really accentuate the district's focus. Meanwhile, when the District 7 chariot exited the tunnel, Capital H cheered for the slightly more revealing outfits that the girls wore. This caused Autumn and Daffodil to roll their eyes, which they hoped Capital H wouldn't catch, but they did. This caused Capital TV producers to praise the District 7 girls a lot less. Meanwhile, when the District 9 chariot left the tunnel, Capital H cheered for the more wholesome outfits for the younger tributes, although Millie started to get itchy under her dress of wheat and started to scratch herself. This caused Capital producers to say that the District 9 girl was unprofessional, and thus would knock her district score down in the best dressed list. Finally, when the District 10 chariot left the tunnel, Capital H cheered for the outfits the tributes were wearing. They loved the outfits because of the links to old world pop culture. Although Lennox was getting fed up by the outfit and just wanted it off of him, he resisted the urge to take the outfit off, however, and just dealt with it. This caused Capital TV producers to be very conflicted on the winner of the Best Dressed award between Districts 3 and 10. Ultimately, District 3 won the Anderson Fashions Best Dressed Tribute Award. When the chariots got back into the tunnels, Millie ran away from the District 9 chariot and towards the accommodation tower, itching herself like crazy. This caused Betty and Alfonsine to chase after her to see if she was okay. When Betty and Alfonsine finally caught up with Millie, she was crying in a corner of the hallway near the elevators, getting laughed at by other tributes. Betty and Alfonsine knelt down next to the young girl and asked her what was wrong. Millie then stated that she went through an itchy hell for an hour just to lose the whole thing. Betty and Alphonsine sighed and told the girl that wasn't her only chance to get sponsors. It caused Millie to lift her head up a little and smile a little bit. Millie thanked the pair before wiping some tears and slowly standing up with the help of Betty and Alphonsine. The group then got into the elevators and went up to their rooms, where the group bid each other farewell until the next day when training began. In training, Lucian Thorne, victor of the 167th Hunger Games, gave his normal speech about the rules of the training center, and that if any rules are broken, he'd break the person who broke the rules. This usually knocked fear and sense into the troublemakers in the group of tributes. Meanwhile, Argentus Steele, victor of the 154th Games, announced that he would also be watching for rule breaking and would also be quick to enforce the rules, considering he himself is a peacekeeper. This job made sense for both victors, as they were both from District 2, and had a new male mentor take over for District 2's male tributes. When Argentus and Lucian released the tributes into the training center, Cassio, Sophia, and Adelaide met up with the von Ultergott siblings, Elia and Brent, both from 5. This group started training in the electrical station at first. They got super close during the duration of training, and moved from station to station. Cassio even flirted with Alia whenever he could, which caught Alia off guard, but it still made her happy, as no other guy had flirted with her before. Meanwhile, Autumn, Daffodil, Jack, Bermuda, and Bastion stuck around the swimming station, where Bermuda and Bastion taught Autumn, Daffodil, and Jack how to swim. This group got very good at this relatively quickly. After a while, Jack agreed to train the pair from 4 with axe throwing, while Autumn and Daffodil worked on their dodging. Every time Autumn and Daffodil failed to dodge an attack in the simulation, Amara and Dior would laugh at them. This caused Autumn to ultimately walk over to them, and when she was about to throw a punch, Amara pointed up to the room where Argentus and Lucian were watching the situation intently. This caused Autumn to roll her eyes and nudge Amara's shoulder in a friendly manner before stating that she was just joking, although anger still flowed through her veins. Amara just giggled before leaving the reflexes station with Dior. Meanwhile, Bermuda and Bastion were picking up on axe throwing pretty quickly. Although their weak selves couldn't really hit the targets, Jack was just proud of them, proud they were getting the axes in the air for more than a millisecond. Meanwhile, Adira and Amarentius laughed at the trio which made Jack's eye twitch. He ultimately decided not to act on his impulses to attack the District 2 tributes, especially because the 2 victors watching over the training room were from District 2. Meanwhile, Millie met up with Betty and Alphonsine, and they went together to the survival station. This is where Betty taught the others how to start a fire. Meanwhile, Millie and Alphonsine were getting close. It was clear to Capitolites that a sort of thing that people in the old world would call puppy love was forming between the pair. Eventually, Millie and Alphonsine picked up on how to start a fire. They did this relatively quickly for people who had never done it before. Millie then agreed to teach Betty and Alphonsine about poisonous plants in the toxicology station. Betty and Alphonsine picked up on this relatively quickly for people who were new to the skill. While Betty and Alfonsine were testing their skills, Millie looked up to see Lucian and Argentus looking, taking, taking notes of the trio training together and how they were all quick to pick up on relatively new skills. Meanwhile, Cornac and Arborio met up with Florence and they went over to the Reflexes station. This trio of boys were the only people to not laugh at Autumn and Daffodil whenever they failed at dodging, which was probably because they were scared of the pair from 7, but the girls from 7 found it kinda cute. The pair eventually agreed to help the trio train in axe throwing. Cornac, Arborio, and Florence actually did pretty well, even though their districts don't usually use axes in their respective industries. The group of District 7 tributes then asked Cornac, Arborio, and Florence if they'd like to join their alliance with the District 10 tributes. The trio looked at each other with confused looks. The other 3 districts in the alliance are strong districts and strong tributes. What would they want with some weak District 9 tributes and a relatively weak District 11 tribute? Finally, Colby, Berlina, and Lennox started by training on their own in the Mutt Station. Colby and Lennox were both super good at this skill and taught Berlina how to distinguish the dangerous mutts from the friendly ones. After a while, the trio went over to the axe throwing station, where Autumn and Daffodil were still training Cornac, Arborio, and Florence, while Jack was still training Bermuda and Bastion. This group then all went over to the plant identification station, where Cornac, Arborio, and Florence excelled in this skill. It took a while for the rest of the group to catch up in skill with the trio, but they eventually did. During tribute evaluations, Cassio rewired an electrical circuit. It wasn't the most impressive skill, but it could help with possibly rewiring the mines around the podiums. Although this skill wasn't the most impressive, he still managed to score a respectable 6. Meanwhile, Sophia and Adelaide both showed skill with bow and arrows. Sophia hit more bullseyes with her arrow than Adelaide did, but at the end of the day, they both scored a 8. Meanwhile, Jack, Autumn, and Daffodil all showed immense skill in axe throwing. Jack hit the most targets out of the 3, with Autumn getting a close second in terms of score. At the end of the day, Jack scored a 9, Autumn scored a 8, and Daffodil scored a 7. Meanwhile, Cornac impressed the evaluators with his new skill in axe throwing. He actually hit a surprising amount of targets for a 12-year-old. This caused him to score a surprising 10, the second highest training score this year, just behind Adira from 2. Arborio also showed off his new skill of axe throwing, but missed most targets. This did not at all impress evaluators, and thus would most likely get him a low score. This was proven true when Arborio got a score of 4. Still not the lowest training score this year, though. Millie showed off her skill in identifying poisonous plants. This was generally regarded as a useful yet boring skill among tribute evaluators. This would earn her the lowest training score this year at a measly 2. Meanwhile, Colby showed his immense physical prowess. He threw heavy weights around the room with ease and easily picked up a rack full of weapons and moved it. Although he was quite strong, the evaluators didn't give him a high score, as his strength still hadn't impressed them. Thus, Colby got a score of 5. Meanwhile, Lennox showed his skill in knife throwing. He had picked up on this skill while he was training on his own away from the group. This skill actually impressed Argentus and Lucian themselves. This caused Lennox to receive a training score of 10. Finally, Berlina showed her skill in identifying mutts. This skill was also regarded as a useful yet boring skill to show to the evaluators. Thus, this skill earned her a score of 3, being the second lowest training score this year. Other notable training scores were Adira from 2 with an 11, Amara from 1 with a 9, Dior from 1 with a 9, Emerentius from 2 with an 8, Florence from 11 with a 7, and Bermuda from 4 with a 7. In the accommodation rooms, mentors of the high scorers showed pride for their tributes, while the mentors of the low scorers showed immense disappointment in them. Briscoe showed immense pride in Lennox, but was disappointed in Berlina and Colby. Although the pair tried their best, they didn't get high enough scores for Briscoe's sake. Meanwhile, Flaxen showed pride in his sons. Even though Arborio got a score of 4, he tried his best, and that's what mattered. He also showed pride in Millie. He knew how truly hard it was to impress the evaluators, and he didn't hold it against the low scorers he had in the past. Meanwhile, Hollis showed immense pride in Autumn and Daffodil. Although they had a lower score than Jack, they still were among the top scorers and thus were worthy of love and pride from her. Meanwhile, Jason showed immense pride in Jack. Although Jack got a lower score than a 12-year-old boy from District 9, Jason still was proud of Jack for getting a high score anyways. Finally, Clarion showed pride in his tributes. All 3 of his tributes this year got relatively high scores compared to his past tributes. He had high hopes for the trio and was starting to get attached, something that no mentor should ever do in their line of work. The night of the interviews, fear flowed through most tributes' veins as they stood backstage. For most tributes, this was their last chance to get sponsors. Millie was especially terrified because of her terrible tribute parade presentation and her terrible tribute evaluation score. This was her last chance, so she had to make it count. She just didn't know how. Up first was Cassio. When on the stage, Cassio spoke with elegance and pride. He had picked up on what actions the capital loved from the tributes of Districts 1 and 2, and so he decided to use as much of those actions as possible. He was kind and looked presentable. He put a smile on his face as his first question was asked, and wore this same smile throughout his interview. He was asked questions like how he felt when he was reaped. He answered this question by stating that he felt like this was the perfect opportunity to show pride for his district. This caused cheers from the Capitol crowd around the stage. Every question he answered caused the crowd to cheer for him, and it seemed like he was going to steal all the sponsors away from everyone. This just made Millie's fear worse. Meanwhile, during Sophia's interview, she walked onto the stage with elegance and grace. The gorgeous young woman wore a red dress which was definitely a favorite outfit worn by her by most people in the room, even the tributes backstage. The dress was tight fit and slim, revealing just the right amount of skin to make Capitolites happy while still being family friendly. She wore a smile and her hair was in a braid. Capital TV reporters in the room were caught off guard by the young woman and her appearance, but still mustered up the words to say that Sophia was looking fine tonight, and that tonight was definitely her night. Her confidence even shone through her answers to the questions she was asked. The final question she was asked caught her off guard. The question was if she had anyone special waiting for her at home. She looked backstage at Adelaide, who was watching the TV screen intently, reading the subtitles. Sophia then looked back at the interviewer and answered the question by saying, "Not at home." This answer confused most, but it seemed the interviewer, the mentors backstage, Adelaide, Cassio, and the Capital TV reporters got what she meant. During Adelaide's interview, she walked onto the stage with a shy demeanor. She was scared that she wouldn't see Sophia again after this. The thought of losing Sophia leaked into her answers to all of the questions that were asked of her. This clear fear disappointed the Capital and made Cassio cringe. Adelaide saved herself, though, with her answer to the last question, when she declared her love for Sophia. This made the tributes backstage and the Capital viewers gasp. The only people who weren't caught by surprise with this mention were Cassio, Sophia, Alia, Brent, and Clarion. During Jack's interview, he walked out onto the stage with confidence oozing from every pore in his body. He shook hands with the interviewer and took a seat to the sound of cheers by the Capital crowd. His answers to the questions asked of him contained that same air of confidence that his entrance to the stage had. He even answered questions about his marriage with Daffodil and what his feelings towards Autumn were, to which he replied by whispering in her ear something that was meant to be off record before answering the question with something nice for the Capital crowd. Although Jack's answer was meant to be off record, we have special access to the answer he whispered in the interviewer's ear. He had whispered that he thought that Autumn was annoying and a bratty little girl with mommy issues, which his wife Daffodil doesn't suffer from, even though they have the same mom. Autumn is just a spoiled brat. During Autumn's interview, she walked down onto the stage with confidence that only a spoiled, rotten girl could have. It was immediately evident that Jack wouldn't be the only one to think of Autumn the way he did. The interviewer sighed and stood up to welcome the spoiled brat onto the stage with open arms. Autumn smiled and shook the interviewer's hand before sitting down. Autumn's questions were targeted towards her home life instead of what she would do in the arena. Although Autumn found this odd, she still answered the questions to the best of her abilities. She stated that she had a 2-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son back at home, with another child on the way via an egg donor. This caused the interviewer to ask why Autumn volunteered. This led Autumn down a rabbit hole where she answered that she was starting to get broke and wanted to win in order to take care of her children. This caused the Capital crowd to make sympathetic sounds due to Autumn's answers. At the end of the interview, the interviewer asked Autumn what she would do in the arena in order to return home to see her children. Autumn answered this question by stating that she would do whatever it took to return home. This caused cheers from the Capital crowd as Autumn got up and left the stage. During Daffodil's interview, she wore a tight-fit short red dress. This dress was among the favorites from all of the interviews so far, along with Sophia's, whose dress was longer but still pretty much the same. Daffodil wore a smile, showing off her beautiful white teeth, and she walked onto the stage. Before sitting down, Daffodil shook hands with the interviewer and waved at the crowd and then sat down. Daffodil's questions were more targeted towards her marriage with Jack and how Jack felt about her wearing this super revealing dress. Daffodil responded by saying that Jack didn't know she was wearing this dress until now. This caused sounds of interest from the Capital, along with cheers. Daffodil was also asked why she volunteered, to which Daffodil replied solemnly by saying that she had no idea that Jack was planning on competing too. This caused sympathetic sounds from the Capital crowd as the interviewer asked Daffodil her last question. After answering her last question, Daffodil got up and bowed down in front of the Capitol before walking elegantly off the stage. During Cornac's interview, he wore a nice navy blue suit with red accents to finish off the outfit. When he walked out onto the stage, he had an air of innocence around him. He would answer some questions with a sort of confused and jumbled up answer, but others as if he knew what he was talking about. There was one question, however, that caught him off guard. The interviewer had asked him if there was someone special waiting at home for him. He was only 12. How was he supposed to know? He eventually answered in the negative, which gained unsurprised sounds from the Capitol. After he answered this final question, Cornac got up from his seats and waved bye to the crowd before walking off the stage. During Arborio's interview, he wore a similar suit to Cornac's. Actually, as far as the Capitol was concerned, it was the exact same suit. He smiled and shook the hand of the interviewer before sitting down. His questions were more targeted towards how he felt about his dad being a previous victor. Arborio would answer his questions honestly. Even after one of his questions ended in him offending his father with his answer. After a few more questions, Arborio was asked if he was going to form an alliance with the other tributes from his district. This is when Arborio admitted to being a part of an alliance with his brother, but he also let out that Millie was not a part of this alliance. This surprisingly caused hatred for Cornac and Arborio throughout the Capitol. Eventually, Arborio got up and left the stage, ending his interview off early. During Millie's interview, she wore a beautiful blue dress. This dress was met with rapturous applause from the crowd of Capitolites. This caused Millie to smile and regain her composure, losing any ounce of fear she once had. She was asked questions about who she was allied with. Millie would smile and answer that she had built a strong rapport with the tributes from 12. This caused the Capitolites to cheer for Millie. Now the Capitol believed that Millie might have had a chance. After a few more questions, Millie stood up, still smiling, and shook hands with the interviewer before Millie was escorted off of the stage. During Lennox's interview, he wore a navy blue suit. When he walked onto the stage, he was greeted by rapturous applause from the Capitolites. Being related to someone who was previously known to give her life to save Durian, Lennox was already well loved within the Capitol. Lennox was asked questions about his sister, which made him mad, but he managed to hide his anger as the interview went on. After a few more questions, Lennox was about to burst with anger, and it became very obvious to the tributes backstage. The tributes from Districts 4 and 7 prepared to run out onto the stage to stop a fight from breaking out. Luckily for them, their prep wouldn't need to be used, as Lennox just apologized to the audience and interviewer before getting up and walking off the stage, and punching a hole in the wall backstage when he got off the stage. During Colby's interview, he wore a basic black and white suit. When he walked onto the stage, he too received rapturous applause from the Capitol crowd. Before sitting down, he shook hands with the interviewer. The interviewer immediately got into the interesting questions. She asked Colby why he had volunteered, to which he replied that he volunteered to protect Berlina. He then continued by saying that he used to be Berlina and Bianca's babysitter. The sisters always treated him with respect and love. He volunteered in order to show Berlina that same love and respect. This caused applause as the interviewer continued. The final question the interviewer had asked was if Colby had anyone special waiting at home. Colby then brought up his best friend Sam. Hehe, Sam and Colby reference. This garnered surprise sounds from the Capitol crowd until Colby specified that he and Sam were just friends and that's all. After his final question, Colby got up from his seat and bowed to the crowd before walking off of the stage. During Berlina's interview, she wore a white dress very reminiscent of a wedding dress. Berlina was nervous, but she didn't let it show. She put on a smile and shook hands with the interviewer before sitting down and letting the interviewer start her interview. Berlina answered all the questions with a slightly confident air to her. She didn't know how confident was too confident, so she didn't overdo it. Her last question was what she would do in order to win and return home to her twin sister. Berlina answered this by saying that she would kill whoever she had to. In reality, she had no idea what she was going to do. She was just saying what she thought the Capitol crowd would like. After her final question, she stood up and hugged the interviewer before walking off the stage to applause. After all the interviews had concluded, head game maker Leviathan Al-Fayed walked onto the stage in a basic suit. This suit didn't really reveal what the arena was. Leviathan couldn't really think of a suit to wear in order to hint at what the arena could possibly be. The interviewer begged Leviathan to reveal what the arena would be this year, but Leviathan wouldn't budge. At the end of his interview, Leviathan admitted that he had some tricks up his sleeve for the arena. He then said that without tricks, the arena would be quite boring. In the District 10 accommodation room, Berlina paced back and forth in front of a large window in the main room. Lennox and Colby, on the other hand, would be chatting on the couch about how they would get Berlina home. They both agreed to work together to do this, even if it meant killing themselves to do it. Meanwhile, in the District 9 accommodation room, Millie glared intensely at Arborio and Cornac. The boys felt bad for not including Millie in their alliance with the 4s and 7s. Eventually, the boys walked up to her in order to apologize, but all they received was a punch in the face by Millie, before Millie stormed into her room and slammed the door in their faces. In the District 7 accommodation room, Autumn walked into the room and closed the door. She then walked over to Jack and pinned him to the wall. She stated that she knew that Jack lied during his interview and demanded to know what he said about her to the interviewer. As far as the Capitol knows, Jack never told Autumn what he said to the interviewer, though. Eventually, Daffodil came in and practically saved Jack from the situation he was in. Daffodil took Jack into their room, and eventually the Avox in the room accounted that the two got intimate that night, with her and Autumn left in the main room to hear it. Finally, in the District 3 accommodation room, Cassio and Clarion chatted in the main room of the accommodation room, as Sophia and Adelaide went into one of the bedrooms for some alone time. Eventually, Clarion and Cassio heard the two girls getting intimate as well. The Avox in the room soon accounted that Clarion and Cassio high-fived each other, with Cassio claiming all the credit for getting the two girls together. President Pontus Vesta and head game maker Leviathan Al-Fayed both worked together to come up with a plan to stir the pot, as it were. They decided that they would send the 28 tributes to the arena in 4 different hovercrafts. And Hovercraft 1 was Amara from 1, Sophia from 3, Bermuda and Bastion both from 4, Jack from 7, Colby from 10, and Florence from 11. Then Hovercraft 2 was Dior from 1, Millie and Cornac both from 9, Lennox and Berlino both from 10, and Betty and Alfonsine both from 12. And Hovercraft 3 was Adira from 2, Adelaide and Cassio both from 3, Elia from 5, both tributes from 6, and Autumn from 7. And Hovercraft 4 was Emerentius from 2, Brent from 5, Daffodil from 7, both tributes from 8, Arborea from 9, and the girl from 11. In Hovercraft 1, Jack only recognized four tributes in the Hovercraft with him. These 4 tributes he recognized were Bermuda, Bastion, Colby, and Florence. Colby was sat directly next to Jack. Florence was sat next to Colby, and Bastion and Bermuda were sat at the opposite side of the aisle from Colby and Jack. Meanwhile, Amara and Sophia didn't really recognize any of the tributes in the Hovercraft with them. They were sat across from each other, and so they naturally started to chat. Amara even asked Sophia if what she had said about having feelings with Adelaide was true. Sophia would nod in response to the girl, and Amara nod in respect. In Hovercraft 2, Millie glared at Cornac, who was sat across from her. Millie did notice that her allies were from 12 were in the Hovercraft as well. Betty was 3 seats away from Millie with Alfonsine, and Alfonsine was across from Betty. Meanwhile, the tributes from 10 were sat in between Millie and Betty, along with Dior. Dior laughed at the outlier tributes sat around him. This caused Berlina to slap Dior, causing the Peacekeepers to threaten her with their guns. This caused Lennox to get in between the ensuing chaos and save Berlina from being shot by the Peacekeepers. In Hovercraft 3, Adelaide and Cassio were sat across from each other, with Autumn sat right next to Cassio. Alia was sat right next to Adelaide, and Adira was right next to her. The 2 people from 6 were sat next to Adira and Autumn. The 2 tributes from 6 didn't speak at all on the Hovercraft ride. Meanwhile, Adelaide used sign language to communicate with Alia and Cassio. The 3 talked about their alliance with each other. They also talked about what they would do when they got into the arena. Meanwhile, Adira glared at Autumn. She was pissed off that Autumn and the other 7 chose to ally with weak tributes instead of the careers as they should have. As the girl from 6 took out a vial of Morphling from her jacket pocket, Adira was seen to be glaring at the girl as she took her vial of Morphling. In Hovercraft 4, Brent wasn't with any of his allies. Meanwhile, Daffodil had Arborea in the Hovercraft with her to talk to. They talked about some possible strategies in hushed tones. Emerentius glared at Daffodil. His thought process about the tributes from 7 was the same as his district partner. He was pissed that they didn't join the careers and instead decided to ally with the pussies from 4. Daffodil paid no mind to Emerentius and his angry expression. Just as they were in the failed 101st Hunger Games, the tributes were dressed in t-shirts of their district colors and black cargo pants. This definitely confused a lot of tributes, but some somehow managed to connect the dots and figure out what the arena was, or at least figure out the type of arena it was. In Cassio's launch room, Clarion came into the room and reminded Cassio to stick with his allies until he deemed it necessary to turn on them. Cassio looked terrified, as he was also reminded by Clarion to keep Adelaide and Sophia alive for as long as he could.
Cassio looked down and nodded in understanding. In a later interview with Clarion, he admitted that Cassio was terrified that he would never see his family again. Clarion did try to talk Cassio out of this fear by saying that Cassio had as much of a chance as anyone else in the arena. This did seem to help a little, and Cassio stepped into the tube. In Sophia's lunchroom, Clarion admitted that either Sophia or Adelaide were gonna be huge targets and that the two of them should run away from the cornucopia and hide. Sophia took in this information and nodded in understanding. Clarion then said that Sophia should find some way to communicate this plan to Adelaide, as he didn't have time to visit all three of his tributes. Sophia would nod at this before stepping into her tube. Meanwhile, in Adelaide's lunchroom, Clarion wasn't able to visit her, and so she paced around the room. She was terrified about the bloodbath. Her and Cassio had already talked about her and Sophia running away from the cornucopia together, while Cassio, Brent, and Alia grabbed supplies. She didn't want to lose her friends, though, but she didn't want to lose Sophia either, so she had agreed to run away with Sophia. When the countdown started, a peacekeeper motioned for Sophia to get into her tube, which she did. In Jack's room, Jason visited Jack and told him to stick with his allies until it was too dangerous to. Jack would give Jason a respectful nod. It was later revealed in an interview with Jason that Jack did seem a little scared, especially when it came to the possibility of losing his wife. Jason tried to calm Jack down until the countdown began. Jack eventually hugged Jason before getting into his tube and taking a deep breath. In Daffodil's room, Hollis told Daffodil to remember what they talked about the night before the interviews. Daffodil confirmed that she remembered this and had told all the other allies what she was told, and so they knew as well. Hollis nodded before stating that she wasn't going to visit Autumn. Daffodil giggled and nodded in understanding, saying that she wouldn't want to visit her before the games either. In Autumn's lunchroom, Autumn waited for Hollis to visit her, but Hollis never arrived. This made Autumn mad, and she flipped a table and screamed out in anger. Eventually, the countdown began, and Autumn was forced into her tube when peacekeepers threatened her with their guns. In Millie's lunchroom, Millie was surprisingly the first tribute Flaxen visited out of the 3 tributes he had to visit. Flaxen reportedly apologized to Millie about his sons and hugged Millie. He also wished Millie luck in the games and told her to stick with the 12s for as long as possible. Millie smiled and nodded at Flaxen, hugging him before getting into her tube. In Cornac's lunchroom, Flaxen eventually arrived. Flaxen hugged his youngest son for what could have been the last time. Cornac cried into Flaxen's shoulder as the pair hugged. Flaxen couldn't even think properly for information to tell Cornac. The two just embraced until the countdown began, and Cornac had to get into his tube. Cornac cried and put his hand up against the glass of the tube as he was raised into the arena. In Arborio's lunchroom, he was never visited by Flaxen. Arborio just paced around the room, thinking about his brother and his father. What would they think if his fate was the same as so many other District 9 tributes before him? Only time would tell what would happen to Arborio. When the countdown started, Arborio got into his tube and prayed. In Colby's lunchroom, Briscoe told him to keep Berlina alive as long as possible. even if that meant giving his own life to do so. Colby would nod at this, ready to die to keep Berlina alive if necessary. When the countdown began, Colby stepped into his tube and sighed. In Berlina's lunchroom, Briscoe came into the room with Berlina, and while Berlina was pacing back and forth in the room, Briscoe told Berlina to stick close to her allies in the arena and to not leave their side. This scared Berlina, but she agreed and hugged Briscoe. When the countdown started, Berlina got into her tube and started to cry as the tube closed around her. Finally, in Lennox's room, Briscoe didn't have time to visit him. Lennox was okay with this. Him and Briscoe had talked about this during the interviews, and Briscoe agreed to visit Berlina and Colby instead. Lennox looked around the room at the peacekeepers surrounding him. When the countdown began, Lennox stepped into his tube and turned to look back into the room as the tube closed around him. After all the tubes were closed, something different occurred in half of the tubes. Half of the tubes lifted into the arena like they normally did. This half included the tubes of Amara, Emerentius, Cassio, Adelaide, Alia, both tributes from 6, Jack, the boy from 8, Millie, Cornac, Arborio, Florence, and Betty. Meanwhile, the other half of the tubes had their floors give out and drop the tributes into the arena. This half included the tubes of Dior, Adira, Sophia, Bermuda, Bastion, Brent, Autumn, Daffodil, the girl from 8, Berlina, Lennox, Colby, the girl from 11, and Alphonsine. When Berlina fell into the arena and onto her podium, she found it hard to find her footing and almost fell off of her podium. But eventually she did find her footing and stood up on her podium. She looked around at all the other tributes who were lucky enough to be raised into the arena the normal way, until a couple more tributes fell into the arena. The next 2 tributes to fall into the arena were the girls from 8 and 11. These girls weren't as lucky as Berlina was. They both failed to find their footing and fell off their podiums, blowing up. This caused a lot of tributes to scream, and some to fall on their knees and cry, especially the younger tributes like Berlina, Bastion, Cornac, and Berlina. When all the tributes were in the arena on their podiums, President Pontus Vesta came onto the intercoms and wished all the tributes luck before starting the countdown. Cassio looked around for his allies. He eventually noticed that Adelaide was 2 podiums away from him on his left. Meanwhile, Alia was right next to him on his right, and Brent was right next to him on his left. Eventually, while Cassio was looking for Sophia, Adelaide pointed Sophia out across the cornucopia from them, giving Adelaide, Cassio, Brent, and Alia a concerned light. Meanwhile, Jack immediately noticed that Bastion was right next to him on his right. Meanwhile, Emerentius was right next to Jack on his left. Jack took a deep breath as he saw Emerentius glaring at him. Autumn was right next to the girl from 8 when she exploded, and so she was already covered in blood, along with the boy from 6, who was located on the other side of the girl from 8's podium from Autumn. Meanwhile, to Autumn's left, Amara was right next to her, focusing on a scythe right in front of her. Daffodil was right next to the girl from 11 when she blew up, which scared her when the girl's blood got on her t-shirt. When Daffodil looked to her left, she saw Adira and jumped a little when she noticed Adira was glaring at her. Meanwhile, Millie was immediately surrounded by her allies. Betty was right next to her on her left, and Alphonsine was right next to her on her right. Nothing was in between her and her path of escape with Betty and Alphonsine. Arborio and Cornac were lucky enough to be right next to each other as well. Immediately to Cornac's left was Florence. Meanwhile, immediately to Arborio's right was Emerentius. Finally, the District 10 tributes were all lucky enough to be right next to each other. Berlina was in the middle of the trio. Right next to Colby on his left was Bastian. Meanwhile, right next to Lennox on his right was Sophia. When the gong sounded, all manner of chaos broke out. When they heard the gong, Cassio motioned for Adelaide to run to Sophia and run away from the cornucopia together. That's exactly what Adelaide attempted to do. Before she could get too far, though, Adelaide was tackled to the ground by Dior. Dior held a knife to Adelaide's throat. Before he could do anything, though, Sophia pushed Dior off of Adelaide and picked her up before running away from the cornucopia. Meanwhile, Cassio ran in and grabbed a sleeping bag and a knife before looking around for Brent and Alia. The pair from 5 had grabbed a couple of water bottles and some food before meeting up with Cassio. The trio then ran away from the cornucopia and tried to find Sophia and Adelaide. Jack immediately ran into the cornucopia and grabbed an axe, which he immediately threw into Emerentius' chest. Jack then found Florence and Colby, who were grabbing a scythe and a sword respectively. Florence then stabbed Amara in the chest and then in the forehead with the scythe. Meanwhile, Colby stabbed Adira in the heart with his sword. This trio then realized that with only one career remaining, they could easily tip the scales in favor of their alliance. Autumn and Daffodil immediately ran into the cornucopia and met up with each other. They both grabbed a set of throwing knives. Autumn then smirked and threw a throwing knife at Daffodil. Daffodil ducked under the knife before tackling Autumn to the ground and forcing one of her knives into Autumn's throat. Daffodil then got up and ran over to the others.